She never imagined that the person who promised to love her forever would be the one plotting her death. Shonda Powell gripped the steering wheel, her heart pounding as her car lurched unnaturally. The brakes, her only safeguard, had been tampered with, and for the first time, the life she thought was secure felt like a trap. Brandon Powell leaned against the doorway, smirking, a chilling calmness in his eyes that made the room seem colder. Shonda's breath caught as she noticed a shadow outside the window, Vanessa Powell, Brandon's sister, observing silently, her expression unreadable, hinting that help might come from the most unexpected corner. A tiny spark of hope flickered, though Shonda didn't know how or when it would ignite. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment telling us your current location and local time, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow Shonda's journey as it unfolds. The morning had started like any other, with sunlight streaming softly through the Powell residence's large bay windows. Shonda Powell, still shaken from the unsettling feeling in her car yesterday, tried to push the memory out of her mind. She needed to focus on work, on life, but a gnawing unease tugged at her chest. Every glance at the driveway reminded her of the barely there scratch on her car's bumper, the sudden jerk she felt when she hit the brakes, the momentary panic that almost made her lose control. Her hands trembled slightly as she sipped her coffee, her eyes darting toward the front door every so often. Brandon Powell appeared in the doorway, leaning casually against the frame. His posture suggested relaxation, but Shonda recognized the subtle tension beneath the surface, the kind of tension that preceded a storm. "Morning," he said, his voice unusually calm, almost too controlled. He smiled, a practiced charm that barely masked the coldness in his eyes. Shonda forced a smile in return, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her fear. She had learned that showing weakness was dangerous around him. Brandon stepped closer, picking up a newspaper from the counter. "I went by the dealership this morning," he said casually. "Had a little talk with someone about your car." The words sank like a stone in Shonda's stomach. She knew instantly that something was off. The casual tone didn't fit the subject. It was too pointed. Shonda placed her coffee cup down, trying to steady her breath. "A talk?" she asked carefully, trying not to reveal the sudden spike of panic in her chest. "Just routine maintenance." Brandon replied, smiling faintly, though the smirk in his eyes betrayed him. He always had a way of making danger sound benign. But the thought of the car, the brakes, made Shonda's pulse spike. She remembered the jerk, the uncontrollable lurch. The thought that someone could have deliberately tampered with her safety hit her with a chilling force. Her mind raced. Could he really be so cruel? The man she married, the man she trusted with everything, her heart, her future, her very life, could have done something so cold-blooded. She shook her head, trying to convince herself she was overthinking. But deep down, a sinking certainty told her she was not. Before she could respond, Tasha Miller, her closest friend, arrived unannounced. Tasha's presence was a balm to Shonda's frayed nerves. She stepped inside, giving Shonda a quick, assessing look. "You okay?" she asked, her voice low, aware of Brandon's proximity. Shonda forced a nod. "Yeah, just tired." Tasha didn't push further. She had known Brandon long enough to understand that any confrontation now would be dangerous. Instead, she subtly moved toward the living room, dropping her bag with a soft thud. Her eyes scanned the space, catching every detail, every slight movement, every lingering glance Brandon threw her way. She was silent but alert, ready to protect, ready to assist. Brandon, oblivious to Tasha's scrutiny, continued his casual pacing around the kitchen. He poured himself a glass of orange juice, seemingly relaxed, yet Shonda could feel the predatory energy radiating off him. He was a man accustomed to control, a man who thrived on manipulation, and today the tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating. Shonda excused herself, claiming she needed to check on something in the garage. Her hands were shaking slightly as she reached the car, her eyes tracing the wheels, the brake lines, the familiar interior. She ran her fingers along the steering wheel, imagining the day she had nearly lost control. Her stomach churned. Someone had tried to harm her, and it was no accident. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Brandon had done this. Back in the living room, Vanessa Powell observed silently from outside the large window. Shonda couldn't see her, but she could feel the presence, a watchful shadow that radiated intensity. Vanessa's eyes were sharp, assessing, and there was an unmistakable message in that silent observation. Help would come, but it would be strategic. Vanessa understood the game better than anyone. Brandon might think he was untouchable, but Vanessa had learned firsthand that every empire of cruelty had its cracks. Shonda returned to the house, pretending as if everything was normal. Brandon noticed, of course, and the smirk returned to his face. "Everything okay with the car?" he asked, voice light, mocking in its own subtle way. "Yeah," Shonda replied, her tone measured. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of panic, the hint of fear that would feed his ego. She was calmer than she felt, hiding the storm that raged beneath the surface. Tasha moved closer to Shonda, speaking in a low whisper. "We need to get evidence," she said. "Something solid. I don't think this is just about the car. It's bigger. We need proof." Shonda nodded subtly. The fear was still there, gnawing at her, but alongside it, a new force emerged: resolve. Brandon had underestimated her, underestimated their network of allies, and most importantly, underestimated the fact that Vanessa was watching. Over the next few hours, Shonda kept a careful eye on Brandon's behavior. Every casual movement, every too-smooth phrase, every flicker of a smile was a clue. She and Tasha began taking notes, discreetly photographing documents that hinted at manipulation, recording conversations that might later be admissible as evidence. Brandon, confident in his control, continued his daily routine. He made calls to banks signed off on financial transactions and casually tossed remarks that seemed innocuous but were laced with subtle threats. He didn't notice the small cameras, the discreet notes, or the careful listening that was happening right under his nose. Then came the moment that confirmed Shonda's fears. Brandon, thinking he was alone, made a comment about making sure she never drives that car again. The casual cruelty, the lack of remorse, the cold calculation, it was undeniable. He had tried to kill her, and he had almost succeeded. Shonda's stomach turned, but she didn't panic. Instead, she looked toward the window, knowing Vanessa had seen the same thing. A silent communication passed between them, a promise Brandon's reckoning would come, and it would be precise, undeniable, and inescapable. By evening, Shonda and Tasha had gathered enough initial evidence to begin forming a plan. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about taking control. Brandon's arrogance would be his undoing. His manipulation, his cruelty, his confidence in secrecy, all of it would crumble when faced with meticulous preparation and the quiet, unyielding force of women who refused to be victims. The first act of this slow-burning confrontation had begun. Shonda felt the weight of danger, but also the first flickers of empowerment. Brandon believed he was in control, but the tides were shifting. Every detail was being documented, every move noted, every lie captured. The battle lines had been drawn, and the war for justice was quietly underway. No one in that house realized yet how powerful the combined force of Shonda, Tasha, and Vanessa could be. The calm before the storm was deceptive, but within that calm, a storm was forming, silent, relentless, and about to strike. Shonda Powell couldn't shake the feeling that her life was slowly unraveling. Every morning, even the simplest tasks seemed laced with a subtle threat, as though danger was hiding in the most ordinary moments. Her mind raced, replaying the events with the car, how it had jerked unexpectedly, how Brandon's calm smile had masked something far darker. That day, she decided it was time to stop ignoring the signs. Something was wrong, and she was determined to find out exactly what. After breakfast, Shonda retreated to her home office. She had recently reorganized it for efficiency, but now it became a makeshift investigation hub. Papers, receipts, and digital devices were laid out across the polished desk. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, hesitating for a split second before she began reviewing her bank statements. Each number seemed to mock her every transaction, a potential clue. Slowly, a pattern emerged: small withdrawals here, unexplained charges there. Someone was siphoning resources, someone who had full access and intimate knowledge of her finances. Brandon. Her pulse quickened. Could he really be this meticulous, this calculating? The man she had married, the father of her dreams of a stable future, had been manipulating her from the shadows. Shonda's stomach twisted, but anger and determination mingled with the fear. She couldn't afford to panic, not yet. A gentle knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Tasha Miller stepped in, her expression serious but composed. "Shonda, I've been looking over some things," she said softly. "There's more than just the car. The financial records, the emails you've been ignoring, they don't add up. Brandon's been moving assets, changing signatures. It's all pointing to something premeditated." Shonda exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of confirmation settle on her shoulders. She looked at Tasha, her eyes steady. "I knew something was wrong," she admitted. "But I didn't want to believe it. He's been planning this for months." Tasha nodded, moving closer. "That's why we need to document everything. Every call, every transaction, every suspicious move. We can't fight him blindly. We need proof. Solid, undeniable proof." Shonda spent the next several hours meticulously combing through emails, receipts, and messages. Every digital footprint Brandon left was scrutinized, and slowly a picture of his deception came into focus. There were signed documents she didn't remember authorizing transfers to accounts she didn't recognize, and several phone calls made to unknown numbers at odd hours. It was a web of manipulation, a network of lies carefully designed to destabilize her. Then a subtle clue caught her eye. A message thread she hadn't noticed before, hidden in a subfolder labeled Miscellaneous. Brandon had discussed modifications to the car, referring to them casually as maintenance tweaks, but the context was sinister. The language was coded casual to anyone else, but clear to her, it wasn't about safety. It was about control, about threat, about ensuring she never felt secure again. Shonda's hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the clarity of understanding. Brandon had always been clever, always 3 steps ahead, but he had made a mistake. He hadn't accounted for Vanessa Powell. She was watching, always observing, always calculating. Shonda realized then that she wasn't completely alone in this battle. There was an ally in the shadows, someone who had both motive and skill to counter Brandon's cruelty. Her phone buzzed an encrypted message from Vanessa. It was short, almost cryptic. "I see everything. Don't act rashly. Gather evidence. Timing is everything." Shonda's heart leapt. The mere confirmation that Vanessa was aligned with her ignited a cautious hope tempered by the knowledge that Brandon's schemes were far from over. Shonda immediately relayed the message to Tasha, whose expression sharpened with focus. "This changes everything," Tasha said. "We're not just reacting anymore, we're strategizing. But we need to move carefully. Brandon will notice if we make any obvious moves." The day stretched into evening as Shonda and Tasha worked in silence, their collaboration seamless. They cross-referenced bank statements, photographs of Brandon's documents, and recordings of casual conversations that hinted at his manipulations. Shonda marveled at Tasha's precision and insight. Her friend wasn't just helping. She was a strategist, a partner in reclaiming power. Amidst the flurry of investigation, Shonda noticed subtle changes in Brandon's behavior. He seemed distracted, more irritable, glancing frequently at her computer screen, lingering in hallways longer than necessary as if testing her reactions. She remained outwardly composed, a mask of normalcy that concealed the meticulous planning happening behind her calm demeanor. Every smile was measured, every word calculated. Brandon thought he was still in control, but the balance of power was shifting. Late that night, Shonda sat alone in her office, the house quiet except for the hum of the laptop. She allowed herself a moment to reflect. Fear still lingered a shadow at the edge of her consciousness, but now it was paired with resolve. She was no longer a passive participant in Brandon's schemes. She was an active force gathering intelligence, setting the stage for the eventual confrontation. Her mind wandered briefly to the near accident, to the lurch of the car, to the cold, calculated smirk on Brandon's face. The memory ignited something fierce within her. Survival was no longer enough. Shonda realized she wanted justice, and justice required strategy, patience, and unwavering focus. Vanessa's presence, though unseen, loomed large in her calculations. Shonda began drafting plans, noting every potential leverage point, every weak spot Brandon exhibited. The knowledge that she had an ally in his own family gave her a silent reassurance this fight was not hers alone. The enemy underestimated the combined intelligence, insight, and determination aligned against him. As she prepared to shut down her laptop for the night, Shonda felt a new energy coursing through her. The fear was still there, but it had transformed into something productive, a sharp edge of clarity and determination. Tomorrow, she would continue to uncover the extent of Brandon's machinations, document every irregularity, and prepare for the moment when she and Vanessa could move decisively. Shonda Powell leaned back in her chair, eyes closing briefly, breathing deeply. She wasn't powerless. She wasn't alone. And she certainly wasn't finished. The realization was liberating. And for the first time in weeks, a sense of control settled over her. Brandon's arrogance had blinded him, and every step he took forward in his cruel game only provided more evidence, more leverage, more ammunition for the inevitable reckoning. Tonight she allowed herself one thought: survival had been the first victory, but understanding and preparation would be the ultimate weapon. The wheels of justice, quiet and deliberate, had begun to turn. The next morning, Shonda Powell awoke with a renewed sense of purpose. The night had been long filled with restless calculations and mental scenarios of Brandon's possible moves, yet by dawn, she felt a clarity that had eluded her for weeks. She knew that confronting Brandon directly, at least for now, would be dangerous. He thrived on control, manipulation, and fear, and Shonda's survival depended on strategy. What she needed most was an ally with equal insight, someone who could anticipate Brandon's moves, and that ally had been silently waiting. Vanessa Powell. The meeting was arranged under the guise of coincidence in a small cafe tucked away in a quiet neighborhood far from the gaze of Brandon and his network. Shonda entered first, her posture composed, eyes scanning the space. Vanessa was already there, sitting in a corner booth, her expression unreadable, on a notebook open in front of her. The sunlight caught the glint of her hair, and for a brief moment, Shonda allowed herself to feel a flicker of hope. Vanessa stood as Shonda approached, a subtle, knowing smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "You made it," she said simply. There was no pleasantry, no overt warmth, only focused precision and a clear understanding of what was at stake. Shonda nodded, sliding into the booth. I didn't know who else I could turn to," she admitted softly, her voice steady despite the tension in her chest. "I can't go through this alone anymore." Vanessa's gaze was sharp, assessing. "You're right," she said. "Brandon is meticulous, controlling, and dangerous, but he has weaknesses, ones he doesn't know we're aware of. And that's where we come in." Shonda felt a surge of relief. She had been gathering evidence with Tasha, collecting documents, recordings, and photographs. But having Vanessa on her side changed everything. Brandon might have underestimated her intelligence and resilience, but he had never anticipated betrayal from his own blood. Vanessa had seen Brandon's methods firsthand, had navigated his manipulations, and knew exactly how to counter them. For the next several hours, the two women laid out every detail. Vanessa shared what she knew of Brandon's finances, his patterns of deceit, and his previous schemes, secrets that Brandon had believed carefully buried. She revealed instances where he had manipulated colleagues, falsified documents, and leveraged fear to maintain control. Each revelation was a shock, but also a confirmation of Shonda's suspicions. Brandon's cruelty was far-reaching, systematic, and deliberate. Shonda listened intently, taking notes, asking questions, and probing for any gaps in knowledge. "How do we make sure he doesn't see this coming?" she asked, her voice low but unwavering. "If he suspects we're aligning against him, he could destroy evidence or manipulate the situation even further." Vanessa leaned back, her eyes never leaving Shonda's face. "We moved quietly, strategically. No sudden confrontations. We collect evidence, document everything meticulously, and wait for the right moment. Timing is everything. Brandon thrives on impulsive reactions. If we stay calm and precise, he has no defense. The conversation shifted to logistics. They discussed how to integrate Tasha into their efforts, ensuring that all movements were coordinated without arousing suspicion. Tasha would continue to gather records, monitor communications, and secure every piece of evidence. Shonda would maintain appearances, interacting with Brandon as though everything were normal while secretly preparing for the moment of exposure. Vanessa would act as the insider, providing crucial insights, access, and guidance on Brandon's likely responses. As the hours passed, Shonda felt a transformation within herself. The fear that had plagued her for weeks began to dissipate, replaced by a quiet determination. She realized that the true power didn't lie in confrontation or immediate revenge. It lay in knowledge, strategy, and the careful orchestration of events. With Vanessa by her side, she could finally see a path forward, a way to reclaim her life and expose Brandon for what he truly was. By the time they parted ways, the alliance had been solidified. Vanessa's parting words were precise, almost like an instruction manual for survival and eventual justice. Document everything. Trust no one, none outside this circle. Brandon is clever, but he underestimates the resilience of those he tries to control. Patience and preparation will win this. Remember that. Shonda left the cafe with a renewed sense of agency. For the first time in weeks, she felt she was not simply reacting to Brandon's moves, she was planning, anticipating, and gaining power. She knew the road ahead would be treacherous, that Brandon would continue to test boundaries, manipulate, and intimidate. But now she had a plan, an ally, and a growing arsenal of evidence. Back at home, Shonda met Tasha in the kitchen, laying out the documents they had gathered so far. We have to integrate what Vanessa told us into our strategy. Shonda said, her tone measured but commanding. Every piece of evidence, every transaction, every subtle hint of his manipulation must be documented and cross-referenced. Nothing can be overlooked. Tasha nodded, her focus absolute. We've got this. We'll build the case layer by layer. Brandon won't see it coming. Together, they began organizing files, creating secure backups, and establishing a timeline of Brandon's deceptive acts. Each piece of evidence reinforced the growing realization that Brandon was not invincible. He was human, and humans made mistakes. His arrogance, his overconfidence, his assumption that he was untouchable, these were the cracks in his armor that Shonda and Vanessa would exploit. As night fell, Shonda reflected on the day's events. She realized that fear had been both a prison and a catalyst. It had forced her to confront the uncomfortable truth about Brandon, to recognize his manipulations, and to seek allies. Without Vanessa, she might have continued floundering, unsure and vulnerable. But now, with strategy, preparation, and partnership, she felt an emerging sense of control. She allowed herself a small moment of quiet pride. The alliance had been formed, the groundwork laid. The path forward was clear, though fraught with danger. Every decision would need precision, every move careful, but for the first time, Shonda felt she could reclaim her life on her own terms. With the city lights twinkling through the window, Shonda Powell understood that this was only the beginning. The battle against Brandon Powell was not about anger or revenge. It was about justice, empowerment, and reclaiming what was rightfully hers. And with Vanessa by her side, she knew that when the moment of reckoning came, it would be thorough, undeniable, and ultimately transformative. Shonda closed her laptop, taking a deep breath. Fear still lingered, but it had transformed into something else. A driving force, a quiet storm of determination and strategy. Brandon's reign of manipulation would not last. The alliance had been forged, the evidence secured, and the stage set. The slow, deliberate process of reclaiming control had begun, and Shonda Powell was ready to see it through. The weekend arrived, and Shonda Powell knew it was time to escalate their efforts. With Vanessa Powell quietly observing Brandon's patterns, and Tasha Miller handling meticulous documentation, Shonda was prepared to immerse herself in the complex task of evidence gathering. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about building an airtight case, one that would eventually strip Brandon of his power and control. Shonda started early reviewing her personal records and the irregularities she had noticed over the past weeks. Bank statements, phone bills, emails, and financial contracts were laid out on her desk. Every oddity, every unexplained charge, every suspicious call all needed to be cataloged and cross-referenced. Her eyes scanned the numbers, her mind working like a machine, connecting dots that Brandon believed were invisible. Meanwhile, Tasha moved through the house, discreetly capturing images of documents that Brandon had left carelessly around the study. Every slip of paper, every contract, every handwritten note could serve as proof of his duplicity. Tasha worked silently, understanding that Brandon thrived on distraction and overconfidence. Her methodical approach ensured that nothing was overlooked, nothing was taken for granted. By mid-morning, Shonda had begun drafting a secure digital archive. Encrypted folders on her laptop housed scanned documents, recordings of phone conversations, and photographs of suspicious transactions. She created a detailed timeline, showing Brandon's manipulations over the previous months. Each entry highlighted a pattern of deceit, a web of control, and a series of calculated acts designed to destabilize her. Vanessa Powell's role was equally crucial. From her vantage point in the company, she had access to internal communications contracts and meetings that Brandon believed were confidential. Vanessa had been taking notes, discreetly observing his movements, and noting inconsistencies in his statements to colleagues and financial institutions. Her insights provided Shonda with context and clarity that only someone within Brandon's inner circle could offer. At precisely noon, Shonda received a discreet text from Vanessa. Check the shared drive. I uploaded the latest files. Watch his schedule closely today. He has a meeting at 2 p.m. that could reveal more. Shonda immediately accessed the shared drive, finding spreadsheets detailing previously hidden transfers, internal memos, and flagged emails that indicated deliberate financial maneuvering. Every file was another piece of the puzzle, another layer of evidence against Brandon. Shonda and Tasha prepared for the afternoon with calculated care. Using a discreet digital recorder, they captured a phone conversation between Brandon and a business associate in which he casually referenced making sure she's distracted. The tone was casual, but the intent was unmistakable. Every word was recorded, every nuance noted, creating a record that could not be dismissed. By 1:30 p.m., Shonda positioned herself near the office entrance, pretending to sort through paperwork while subtly observing Brandon. He arrived shortly after, his presence commanding the room, his confidence palpable. He was unaware that every gesture, every statement, every decision he made that day was being documented by Shonda and her allies. Tasha, stationed in a nearby room with a laptop and phone, was ready to capture anything unexpected. Vanessa, from her strategic position within the company, monitored internal emails and communications, relaying information in real time. The coordination was seamless, a silent choreography designed to catch Brandon in his own web of deceit. As Brandon began the 2 p.m. meeting, discussing upcoming investments and personal arrangements, Shonda focused on his expressions, noting the subtle arrogance in his body language, the overconfidence that had blinded him to the scrutiny surrounding him. Each statement he made, seemingly innocuous, was loaded with implications that Shonda was now fully capable of interpreting and documenting. A breakthrough came mid-meeting. Brandon casually referenced an account number and a series of transactions that were clearly unauthorized. Shonda's heart raced not with fear, but with validation. Here was concrete evidence he had manipulated financial channels in a way that could be proven tied directly to his actions. She discreetly took a photograph of the documents he had spread across the table, careful not to alert him. By the end of the meeting, Shonda, Tasha, and Vanessa had amassed an overwhelming amount of data. Emails, contracts, financial statements, recordings of conversations, photographs of documents, all pointed to a single truth. Brandon had been orchestrating a deliberate campaign to manipulate, control, and endanger Shonda. As the day drew to a close, Shonda and Tasha reviewed their findings. The sheer volume of evidence was intimidating, but empowering. For the first time in weeks, Shonda felt a sense of control. Every detail meticulously catalogued, every act of deceit documented. Brandon's empire of manipulation was not as impenetrable as he believed. Vanessa's message buzzed on Shonda's phone again. "Good work today. We're building something that can't be ignored. Stay sharp. He'll sense it eventually, but he won't know the extent." Shonda smiled faintly, her resolve solidifying. This wasn't just about exposing him. It was about reclaiming her life, asserting her power, and demonstrating that deception, no matter how cunning, could be unraveled by patience, intelligence, and unwavering determination. In the quiet of her office that evening, Shonda reflected on the day's efforts. Fear had transformed into strategy, and strategy into empowerment. Brandon believed himself untouchable, but Shonda now understood that power was not solely in dominance or intimidation. It was in preparation, observation, and the quiet accumulation of proof. Tasha looked up from her laptop. "We're ready," she said simply. "When the time comes, we'll have everything we need. Nothing he says or does can undo what we've collected." Shonda nodded, a calm but firm determination settling over her. "Tomorrow," she said softly, "we continue. Every move, every action, every document, none can be overlooked. He thinks he's in control, but we're rewriting the rules." As night fell, Shonda Powell felt an unfamiliar sense of empowerment. The fear of the past weeks had not disappeared, but it had been transformed into a focused, purposeful force. She was no longer just surviving. She was strategizing, gathering evidence, and preparing for the day when justice would be not only possible, but inevitable. Brandon Powell, unaware of the meticulous documentation, the subtle observation, and the growing alliance against him, continued in his routines with the same casual arrogance he always displayed. He believed he was untouchable, but every careless move, every calculated act of manipulation was being silently recorded, catalogued, and transformed into ammunition for the inevitable confrontation. Shonda leaned back in her chair, allowing herself a moment of quiet reflection. The path ahead was still fraught with danger, but the foundation had been laid. Every step taken today, every recording, every document, every observation had brought her closer to a reckoning that Brandon could neither anticipate nor escape. Tonight, Shonda Powell wasn't just a woman who had survived a near tragedy. She was a strategist, an investigator, and a quiet force gathering strength in the shadows. And when the time came, Brandon Powell would face not only exposure, but the undeniable consequences of his deliberate cruelty. The following week, tension hung over the Powell residence like a dense fog. Brandon Powell had begun to sense subtle shifts in his environment, small anomalies that unsettled him without revealing their source. His usual control felt slightly brittle, though he masked it with practiced confidence. He paced the halls of the house, his phone constantly buzzing with messages from business associates. Yet something in the air gnawed at him, a sense that the world he believed under his command was quietly slipping through his fingers. Shonda Powell maintained a calm exterior, her posture poised, her expression neutral. Inside, a storm brewed, a careful balance of fear, anger, and determination. She had spent days meticulously documenting every irregularity, every suspicious transaction, and every subtle act of Brandon's manipulation. Now she needed to maintain appearances while preparing for the next phase of her plan. Any misstep could alert him, and she could not afford mistakes. Tasha Miller remained a silent sentinel, her presence subtle yet crucial. She continued to gather evidence, observe patterns, and maintain secure backups of all documents. Every whisper of Brandon's voice, every casual remark, was recorded and analyzed. Tasha's methodical approach gave Shonda the freedom to navigate the house with poise, knowing that the foundation for their eventual confrontation was solid. Brandon's behavior became increasingly erratic, though he tried to maintain his composed exterior. At breakfast, he casually mentioned financial meetings, contracts, and upcoming negotiations, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of suspicion. He glanced at Shonda more often than usual, testing her reactions, analyzing every gesture and tone. "Did you review the Henderson proposal?" he asked, his voice steady, but laced with underlying tension. Shonda replied calmly, "Yes, I did. Everything seems in order." She spoke with measured precision, showing no hint of the knowledge she had accumulated or the strategies she had begun to formulate. Brandon's gaze lingered a moment longer, then shifted away. He did not suspect how meticulously she had documented his every action, how every casual comment he made was now evidence in the hands of those he underestimated. Later that morning, Brandon stepped out to attend a brief meeting with a potential investor. Shonda seized the opportunity to review the latest documents Tasha had collected. Among them were internal emails Brandon had inadvertently sent to the wrong recipients, revealing subtle threats and coercion aimed at both colleagues and Shonda herself. Each file, each email, each photograph of documents pieced together a narrative of deliberate manipulation and intimidation. As she worked, Shonda felt the presence of Vanessa Powell in the back of her mind, a quiet reassurance that the sisters' watchful eyes were tracking Brandon's every move. Vanessa's strategic insight had been invaluable, highlighting patterns and vulnerabilities that Shonda might have otherwise missed. The alliance had shifted the dynamic entirely. Brandon, confident in his control over Shonda, was completely unaware that someone from his own family was quietly observing, guiding, and strategizing in parallel. By mid-afternoon, Brandon returned unexpectedly early. He strode into the house with a confident demeanor, but Shonda noticed subtle signs of unease, a slight twitch in his jaw, an almost imperceptible furrow of the brow, the way his eyes lingered too long on the papers Shonda had casually placed on the desk. He was testing boundaries, probing for any signs that Shonda was acting unusually. "Busy day?" he asked, attempting casualness. Shonda smiled faintly, her composure impeccable. As usual, she replied, glancing at Tasha, who nodded subtly in acknowledgement. The silent communication between them was almost imperceptible to Brandon, yet it ensured seamless coordination. Brandon leaned against the counter, his posture relaxed, but his mind raced. He suspected a change, though he could not pinpoint it. His control, once absolute, now felt tenuous. He observed Shonda carefully, noting her calm demeanor, trying to detect any tremor of fear or anxiety, any clue that might reveal her state of mind. Shonda remained outwardly composed, but internally she felt a surge of determination. She had anticipated Brandon's subtle threats, his probing and his attempts to intimidate. She responded with calculated calm, answering questions with precision, maintaining the illusion of compliance while subtly documenting every word and gesture. Throughout the afternoon, Brandon tested her further, making seemingly casual remarks about her schedule, her finances, and her interactions with Tasha. He believed these probes were private, harmless, yet every word was now part of a growing body of evidence that Shonda and her allies were assembling. Each attempt to intimidate was silently catalogued, a testament to his arrogance and underestimation of her resolve. Tasha, meanwhile, ensured that every step was secure. She created encrypted backups of all documents, recordings of conversations, and photographs of potentially incriminating materials. Her presence was a quiet but essential counterbalance to Brandon's overconfidence. She had learned to anticipate his movements, predicting which rooms he would enter, which documents he might handle, and which conversations he might overhear. By evening, Brandon's subtle threats had reached a crescendo. He casually mentioned the car incident from weeks prior, framing it as a minor inconvenience and testing Shonda's response. "I still can't believe how careless you were with that car," he remarked lightly, though the undertone was sharp, almost venomous. Shonda met his gaze steadily. "I know." "It won't happen again," she replied evenly, concealing the whirlwind of evidence she had compiled, the careful planning she had undertaken, and the alliance she had formed with Vanessa. Brandon's smirk faltered slightly, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. He realized, perhaps subconsciously, that Shonda's response lacked fear, a reaction he was unaccustomed to encountering. Vanessa's presence, though unseen, continued to influence the unfolding tension. Shonda knew that the sisters' observation was constant, that every word, every glance, every nuance of Brandon's behavior was being recorded and analyzed. The knowledge that she had a powerful ally in the shadows gave Shonda a silent strength reinforcing her calm demeanor and measured responses. As night descended, Shonda reflected on the day's events. The tension had been palpable, the stakes higher than ever. Brandon's attempts at intimidation had become predictable, almost formulaic, providing her with the perfect opportunity to anticipate, record, and analyze. Fear had not been eradicated, but it had transformed into a tool, a lens through which she could observe, calculate, and prepare for the eventual confrontation. In the quiet of her study, Shonda took stock of the evidence, her mind mapping out the next moves, anticipating Brandon's reactions, and ensuring that every action taken would further tighten the noose of accountability around him. The subtle psychological battle had begun, a contest of calm precision and strategic patience. Brandon believed himself untouchable, yet the foundations of his control were quietly being dismantled piece by piece. Shonda Powell had learned an essential truth that day: power was not merely about dominance or aggression. It was about control, observation, and the ability to respond with deliberate, calculated precision. Brandon's arrogance had blinded him to the fact that his victim was no longer passive, that her allies were vigilant, and that every subtle threat he employed would now become proof of his manipulation. As she finally prepared to rest, Shonda felt a profound sense of clarity. The storm of fear, tension, and uncertainty had not dissipated, but it had been transformed into strategy, focus, and empowerment. She was no longer reacting. She was directing, orchestrating, and preparing for the inevitable reckoning. Brandon Powell's attempts at intimidation had only strengthened her resolve. The game had changed, and the tides were shifting quietly but unmistakably. By the following week, Shonda Powell felt an unmistakable shift within herself. Fear, once sharp and consuming, had transformed into a deliberate, focused resolve. Every small act of manipulation by Brandon Powell had been documented, every suspicious transaction cataloged, every subtle threat recorded. Now it was time to move beyond preparation and enter the next phase, the careful orchestration of her counterattack. Vanessa Powell became the architect of this phase. Over the past days, she had observed Brandon's habits, his patterns of arrogance, and the predictable nature of his manipulations. Sitting across from Shonda at their discreet cafe meeting, Vanessa laid out a comprehensive plan. Brandon thrives on control. She began, voice calm but commanding. He believes that fear and intimidation guarantee compliance. But he underestimates two things: patience and precision. We have both. Shonda listened intently, absorbing every detail. Vanessa outlined a multi-pronged approach, starting with financial exposure. Brandon had a carefully constructed facade, business accounts, offshore transfers, and meticulously falsified contracts that gave him the illusion of invulnerability. Vanessa had identified discrepancies and weak points within these systems. They could leverage these gaps to apply pressure, forcing Brandon into mistakes that would expose his schemes. First, Vanessa explained, we consolidate all evidence of unauthorized transactions, misleading communications, and manipulative acts. This will serve as our foundation. Next, we coordinate the timing of exposure, ensuring that when the truth surfaces, there is no escape, no plausible deniability. Finally, we maintain absolute secrecy. Brandon must never suspect that we are orchestrating a unified strategy. Shonda nodded, the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders, yet tempered by a growing sense of empowerment. And what about his perception of me? She asked. He believes I'm fearful, reactive. How do we maintain that illusion while executing the plan? Vanessa smiled faintly. That's the beauty of it. Fear is an act now, not a reality. He must continue to see the same Shonda he always thought he controlled. Calm, compliant, predictable. But beneath the surface, every action is calculated. He won't see the storm until it's too late. The plan extended beyond mere financial maneuvers. Vanessa emphasized the importance of public perception. Brandon thrived on reputation. His image as a successful, authoritative figure was crucial to his control over colleagues, investors, and even family. By carefully releasing information at strategic moments, they could undermine that image, sow doubt among his associates, and weaken his psychological grip. Tasha Miller became integral in the execution. Her expertise in documentation, secure communication, and digital archiving ensured that no piece of evidence could be lost or misinterpreted. She created encrypted databases, tracked interactions, and maintained detailed logs of all communications. Every call, every email, every casual remark by Brandon was cataloged meticulously, ready to be leveraged at the perfect moment. Shonda and Vanessa also developed contingencies for unexpected moves. Brandon, despite his arrogance, was capable of unpredictable aggression. The plan accounted for potential threats, legal challenges, attempts to intimidate witnesses, or manipulation of employees. Each scenario was addressed with calculated responses, ensuring that Shonda and her allies remained several steps ahead. The strategy meetings were intense yet precise. Shonda found herself growing into a role she had never imagined: strategist, investigator, and silent orchestrator of justice. Fear had not disappeared, but it had been transformed into a focused energy, driving her meticulous attention to detail. Every potential weakness of Brandon's had been mapped, every opportunity identified, every risk evaluated. By midweek, Shonda had begun rehearsing the execution of the plan. Small steps were taken deliberately. She engaged Brandon in casual conversation, subtly probing for inconsistencies, observing his reactions, and documenting nuances that could later serve as evidence. Vanessa provided guidance remotely, alerting Shonda to behaviors that were telling or unusual. Tasha maintained constant surveillance of digital communications, ensuring nothing slipped through unnoticed. The complexity of the plan required synchronization, patience, and absolute discipline. There could be no errors, no hints of premature action. Brandon's perception of control had to remain intact until the moment of exposure arrived. It was a psychological chess game, and Shonda, Vanessa, and Tasha were moving with precision across the board. Evenings were spent analyzing new data. Financial discrepancies, unusual communications, and subtle manipulations were scrutinized, cross-referenced, and integrated into the growing dossier against Brandon. Each revelation bolstered Shonda's confidence, reinforcing the realization that Brandon's meticulous control was not infallible. In fact, his arrogance and overconfidence were the very vulnerabilities they would exploit. The emotional toll was considerable, yet Shonda's resolve deepened. She understood that the plan was not only about retribution, it was about reclaiming power, asserting control over her life, and demonstrating that deliberate, calculated action could counter even the most insidious manipulation. Brandon's cruelty, while frightening in its immediacy, was now a tool, a pattern that could be exposed, documented, and ultimately undone. By the weekend, Shonda had a clear outline for the first phase of execution. Financial manipulations would be highlighted, documents strategically released to create pressure and expose deceit. Simultaneously, subtle psychological maneuvers would unsettle Brandon, leading him to make errors that could be leveraged legally and socially. The coordination of timing, information, and perception was critical. The smallest misstep could compromise the plan. Vanessa's parting instructions were precise. Patience is our greatest weapon. He thrives on immediate reactions. We don't react, we observe, we wait. And when the moment arrives, it must be absolute. Total exposure, no gaps, no escape. Shonda left the meeting with a renewed sense of empowerment. She felt the calm clarity that comes from preparation, from strategy, and from the understanding that her actions were deliberate and controlled. Brandon Powell believed himself untouchable. But the alliance, the meticulous documentation, and the carefully constructed plan ensured that his empire of intimidation and manipulation had cracks that were now about to widen. Returning home, Shonda organized the evidence with renewed precision. Each document, recording, and photograph was cataloged and backed up in multiple secure locations. Every detail was scrutinized for relevance, clarity, and impact. The meticulous nature of the preparation mirrored the precision of the ultimate plan to dismantle Brandon's control, expose his deceit, and reclaim power without giving him the opportunity to retaliate effectively. By nightfall, Shonda Powell reflected on the day's progress. Fear, tension, and uncertainty had been transformed into strategy, preparation, and empowerment. She understood that Brandon's arrogance and overconfidence were his greatest weaknesses. The calculated, silent, and deliberate orchestration of justice would leave him no room for evasion. The plan was in motion, and each step taken was a step toward inevitable exposure and reclamation of her life. Shonda closed her laptop, the weight of responsibility tempered by the satisfaction of preparation. The storm had not yet arrived, but its winds were gathering quiet yet unstoppable. Brandon Powell believed himself in control, but the truth was a force far more powerful than fear. It was methodical, deliberate, and unwavering, and it was poised to strike. The following Monday arrived with a quiet intensity. Shonda Powell moved through her home with purpose. Each step measured, each action deliberate. Brandon Powell remained oblivious to the storm quietly assembling around him, unaware that the very tools he used to control, manipulate, and intimidate were now being turned against him. The day was carefully structured, every meeting, every call, every casual interaction planned to expose, unsettle, and ultimately weaken his hold. Shonda began by reviewing the latest batch of evidence compiled over the previous days. Documents, financial records, and subtle communications were meticulously cataloged, cross-referenced, and organized. Each piece was a potential lever, a strategic point to apply pressure without revealing the larger plan. Tasha Miller, seated nearby with her laptop and secure encrypted drive, coordinated in real time, ensuring that no opportunity was missed and that every discovery was immediately documented. Vanessa Powell played her role with quiet precision, observing Brandon from within the corporate environment. Her access to internal communications, confidential memos, and meetings provided crucial insight. She had identified key vulnerabilities in Brandon's professional network partners, who could be influenced by the selective release of information, colleagues who might question his decisions, and patterns of behavior that revealed arrogance, overconfidence, and ultimately fragility. By late morning, Shonda and Tasha had organized a plan for a subtle yet significant disruption. Shonda would attend a scheduled business meeting with Brandon, appearing composed and compliant, while Tasha monitored communications remotely. Vanessa would provide real-time insights into Brandon's behavior, signaling moments when his overconfidence and careless remarks could be leveraged. The synchronization was delicate. Any misstep could alert Brandon and compromise the entire strategy. At the meeting, Brandon entered the room with his usual air of authority. He greeted Shonda with a smile that he believed masked his suspicion, unaware that every gesture, every expression, and every word was under observation. Shonda's calm exterior best belied the strategic mind working beneath the surface. Every response was calculated, measured, and designed to maintain the illusion of compliance, while subtly drawing out information, revealing inconsistencies, and recording evidence of manipulation. The meeting proceeded with a tense undercurrent. Brandon discussed investments, operational strategies, and upcoming negotiations, confident in his authority and control. Yet subtle cues betrayed him: slight overstatements, contradictory statements, and casual references to decisions that lacked documentation. Shonda noted each discrepancy, photographing documents, recording conversations, and mentally cataloging every detail. Midway through the discussion, a carefully timed intervention occurred. Tasha, remotely monitoring Brandon's emails, flagged an incoming message that inadvertently revealed a misstep, a transfer of funds without proper authorization linked to an offshore account. Shonda discreetly captured the evidence, her pulse steady, knowing that this was the moment when the first real cracks in Brandon's meticulously constructed facade became visible. Vanessa's messages provided guidance in real time. He's overconfident. Press gently on the Henderson deal. Let him reveal the error himself. Shonda followed the instructions flawlessly, posing questions with subtlety, eliciting admissions from Brandon without appearing confrontational. His responses, intended to assert dominance, instead confirmed his duplicity, providing clear, undeniable evidence of manipulation and unethical conduct. As the meeting progressed, Brandon grew increasingly unaware of the dual observations surrounding him. Tasha's monitoring captured each misstep. Every casual lie, every subtle threat directed at Shonda or other colleagues. Vanessa's insider knowledge allowed them to anticipate his reactions, ensuring that each move was maximally effective, leaving him unaware of the comprehensive web of scrutiny he had walked into. By mid-afternoon, the effects of the subtle attack were becoming evident. Brandon's confidence wavered, though he masked it behind a veneer of authority. He made minor errors in his statements, contradicted previous assertions, and inadvertently exposed plans that could be legally and ethically questioned. Shonda, Tasha, and Vanessa documented everything, recognizing that these small cracks would expand into undeniable evidence for the next phase of their strategy. Shonda maintained a poised exterior, carefully navigating the conversation, ensuring that her questions and responses were strategically timed to provoke revelations without arousing suspicion. Brandon, convinced that he remained in control, failed to recognize the coordinated effort quietly orchestrated around him. Each misstep, each subtle exposure, was a triumph for Shonda's meticulous planning and patient observation. As the day drew on, Shonda noticed the subtle psychological impact on Brandon. His habitual overconfidence was beginning to falter, replaced by micro-expressions of doubt and unease. His glances at Shonda were more frequent, searching, almost accusatory, yet he could not pinpoint the source of his discomfort. This subtle shift in power, though invisible to most, was a crucial victory. Brandon's perception of control was being systematically dismantled, one carefully executed step at a time. By evening, the first phase of the double strike was complete. Shonda, Tasha, and Vanessa had accumulated a wealth of real-time evidence. Mismanaged financial transactions, casual admissions of unethical decisions, and inconsistencies in Brandon's statements. Each item, when analyzed collectively, painted a clear portrait of deception, manipulation, and a dangerous reliance on control and intimidation. Shonda reviewed the day's accomplishments, a sense of empowerment coursing through her. She had learned to transform fear into focused anxiety into action, and uncertainty into precise strategy. Brandon's arrogance, once a formidable weapon against her, had become the very vulnerability that she and her allies were exploiting. Every careless move he made, every word he uttered, contributed to the comprehensive record they were assembling. The quiet satisfaction of the day's progress was tempered by awareness of the work yet to come. The subtle, coordinated exposure had revealed cracks, but it was only the beginning. Shonda understood that patience, timing, and continued strategic observation would be critical. Brandon might sense the growing threat, but he could not yet comprehend the full scope of the plan or the depth of the alliance arrayed against him. As night settled over the Powell residence, Shonda reflected on the day's events. The first strike had been executed with precision, revealing vulnerabilities in Brandon's armor while maintaining her outward composure. The psychological and tactical advantages had shifted subtly but decisively in her favor. Tomorrow they would build on this momentum, continuing to tighten the noose of accountability around Brandon Powell, unrelenting, yet silent, patient, yet inexorable. Shonda Powell closed her laptop, taking a deep, steadying breath. The storm had begun silent and deliberate, and each calculated action brought her closer to reclaiming power, exposing deceit, and orchestrating a reckoning that Brandon could neither anticipate nor escape. The double strike was a success, but it was only the prelude to a much larger, unstoppable force that was quietly gathering strength around him. The tension in the Powell residence had become almost palpable. Brandon Powell paced in his home office, the hum of the city outside barely registering as he reviewed documents and emails that seemed at first glance routine. But the details, subtle and persistent, had begun to gnaw at him. A misplaced memo, a discrepancy in an account, an offhand comment from a colleague. Each one planted a seed of doubt he could not shake. He felt the walls closing in, though he could not yet identify the source. Shonda Powell maintained her composure, moving through the house with a calm precision that belied the storm brewing within. Every morning, she meticulously reviewed evidence gathered over the past weeks, connecting dots that Brandon assumed were invisible. Financial records, email exchanges, photographs of documents, and recordings of conversations were cataloged and cross-referenced, forming an airtight record of his manipulation, deceit, and intimidation. Tasha Miller operated like a silent sentinel, monitoring communications, creating secure backups, and maintaining logs of every interaction. Her presence was subtle, yet vital. Every misstep by Brandon was quietly captured, ensuring that Shonda's evidence collection was both comprehensive and impervious to challenge. Tasha's expertise in anticipating Brandon's movements allowed her to capture details that he would have dismissed as insignificant details that would later prove pivotal. By mid-morning, Brandon's unease had intensified. He glanced at Shonda more frequently, noting her calm demeanor and the slight air of control she exuded. He could sense a shift, though he could not pinpoint it. The subtle hints of resistance, the absence of fear, and the quiet determination in her actions unsettled him. His usual confidence was eroding, replaced by a growing paranoia. Shonda used this opportunity strategically. She engaged Brandon in conversation, carefully framing questions to elicit admissions or inconsistencies without appearing confrontational. Her tone remained neutral, her expressions measured. Every word was calculated, every pause deliberate. She knew that provoking him into mistakes without revealing her own intentions was the key to the next phase of their plan. Vanessa Powell remained a silent yet powerful ally, observing from her vantage point within the corporate sphere. Her insights were critical, guiding Shonda and Tasha in real time. Vanessa provided warnings of potential pitfalls, suggested strategic angles for questioning, and identified moments when Brandon's arrogance would lead him to reveal further truths. Her presence, though invisible to Brandon, was a constant force subtly manipulating the battlefield in Shonda's favor. As the day progressed, Shonda and Tasha implemented a series of carefully timed maneuvers. They highlighted discrepancies in financial transactions, questioned inconsistencies in Brandon's statements, and observed his reactions closely. Each interaction, each minor error, and each subtle admission was documented meticulously. The accumulation of these moments created a detailed portrait of Brandon's manipulative behavior, one that could be leveraged for both legal and strategic purposes. By mid-afternoon, the tension reached a critical threshold. Brandon, convinced of his control, began making errors more frequently. Minor contradictions in statements, casual overstatements, and the inadvertent admission of unauthorized actions created openings that Shonda and Tasha quickly exploited. The documentation was meticulous, each error cross-referenced with prior evidence to build an unassailable record. Shonda sensed the moment had arrived for a subtle psychological escalation. She maintained her composed demeanor while strategically pressing Brandon on his recent decisions. Her questions were precise, designed to expose weaknesses without appearing aggressive. Brandon, caught off guard by her poise and insight, responded with irritation and defensiveness, inadvertently revealing further inconsistencies. Tasha, monitoring the interaction remotely, provided updates and guidance. "He's faltering," she messaged. "Maintain composure. Document every slip. Don't give him any clue we're orchestrating this." Shonda nodded silently, her focus unwavering. The combination of psychological pressure and meticulous evidence collection was beginning to pay dividends. Brandon's once unshakable confidence was cracking. Vanessa's guidance became increasingly crucial as Brandon's behavior grew erratic. She identified subtle cues, micro-expressions, tone shifts, and hesitation that indicated he was aware of some threat, yet could not comprehend its full scope. Shonda leveraged this insight, maintaining her calm exterior while strategically pressing on areas where Brandon's arrogance and overconfidence were most vulnerable. By evening, the culmination of their coordinated efforts was evident. Brandon's carefully constructed image of authority and control had begun to falter. Subtle doubts, inconsistencies, and admissions now formed a tapestry of evidence that could not be ignored. Shonda and Tasha reviewed the collected material, noting how each carefully documented misstep would later serve as proof of Brandon's manipulation and deceit. Shonda allowed herself a brief moment of reflection. Fear and tension had been transformed into tools of strategy, precision, and empowerment. Every subtle maneuver, every calculated step had shifted the balance of power. Brandon, confident in his control, was unknowingly unraveling the very facade that had shielded him for so long. As night settled, Shonda prepared for the final stages of the day's work. Each piece of evidence was securely stored, cross-referenced, and ready for integration into the broader strategy. She reviewed recordings, documents, and communications, ensuring that the accumulation of data was coherent, complete, and compelling. The meticulous assembly of evidence had transformed the seemingly chaotic tension of the day into a structured framework for decisive action. Brandon, meanwhile, retreated to his private study, unaware that every step he had taken had been quietly documented, analyzed, and incorporated into Shonda's growing dossier. His perception of control, once absolute, had been systematically dismantled by a combination of psychological insight, meticulous planning, and strategic patience. Every attempt at intimidation, every manipulative act had been recorded and would serve as undeniable proof of his misconduct. Shonda Powell, observing from the periphery, felt a profound sense of empowerment. The day's efforts had elevated her position from reactive to proactive, from fearful to strategic. The subtle psychological and tactical maneuvers had yielded results, weakening Brandon's control, exposing his errors, and building a foundation for the next phase of confrontation. The final reflection of the evening was clear. Brandon Powell had underestimated the strength, intelligence, and resilience of those he sought to control. Patience, precision, and strategic observation had turned his arrogance against him. Shonda understood that the crisis, the high-stakes psychological confrontation, was still unfolding, but she now commanded both the tools and the mindset to navigate it successfully. As she prepared to rest, Shonda felt the quiet power of the day's victories. Each misstep Brandon had made was a step closer to the inevitable exposure. Each subtle revelation, meticulously documented, was another piece of the puzzle that would lead to accountability and reclamation of her life. The storm of confrontation was gathering strength, silent yet unstoppable. And Shonda Powell was poised to meet it with unwavering resolve. The day had finally arrived. Shonda Powell stood outside the towering glass building that housed Brandon Powell's company, her reflection mirrored in the polished windows. The calm determination she felt was almost palpable, a stark contrast to the storm that had been quietly building for weeks. Today was not about fear or reaction, it was about confrontation strategy. And finally, asserting the control she had meticulously reclaimed. Brandon was already inside, pacing the executive suite, with the same air of authority and arrogance he had maintained for years. He believed himself untouchable, confident that Shonda's fear would continue to shield him from exposure. He did not know that patience, careful observation, and precise planning had now turned the tide against him. Every misstep, every subtle act of manipulation had been documented, analyzed, and transformed into ammunition. Shonda entered the building with Tasha Miller beside her. Their pace was measured, deliberate, as if they were simply attending a routine meeting. Every step was synchronized, every gesture intentional, projecting calm authority. Brandon looked up as Shonda entered, a faint smile playing at the corner of his mouth. He believed he was in control, unaware that the very power he wielded so confidently was slipping from his grasp. "Shonda, good to see you," Brandon said smoothly, extending a hand that Shonda did not immediately take. Her smile was measured, courteous, yet firm, controlled, deliberate. "Shonda, we've got a lot to discuss," he continued, motioning toward the conference room, unaware that this was the moment where control would suddenly, irrevocably shift. Inside the room, Shonda and Tasha arranged their documents with precision. Every folder, every digital file, and every piece of evidence was positioned for strategic impact. Shonda's laptop screen displayed encrypted files meticulously organized for clarity and potency. Brandon, confident in his ability to intimidate and manipulate, took his seat, unaware that his empire of deception was about to be systematically dismantled. Vanessa Powell watched from a secure location, feeding Shonda real-time insights via discreet encrypted messages. Her knowledge of Brandon's patterns and tendencies was critical. She advised on timing, emphasized points of emphasis, and highlighted areas where his overconfidence could be leveraged. Shonda followed these cues flawlessly, maintaining the illusion of routine while subtly steering the conversation toward revelations Brandon could not anticipate. The first phase began with casual questions, each phrase to elicit unguarded responses. "I reviewed the Henderson proposal," Shonda said evenly. "Some elements seem inconsistent with what was discussed last month. Could you clarify the discrepancies?" Brandon blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "Discrepancies," he replied, his tone calm but slightly tense. "I think everything aligns. Maybe a misunderstanding." Shonda nodded subtly. "Perhaps. But I want to ensure that everything is transparent and documented. Accuracy is essential for our reporting." Her words were neutral, almost bureaucratic, but the undertone was clear. This was a test, and every word would be scrutinized. As Brandon attempted to maintain composure, subtle cracks appeared. In his effort to assert authority, he overexplained, revealing minor inconsistencies in financial transactions and unauthorized decisions. Every detail he disclosed was immediately cross-referenced, with evidence Shonda and Tasha had compiled. Brandon believed he was controlling the conversation, yet each statement strengthened the case against him. Tasha monitored, silently prepared to highlight additional evidence if Brandon attempted to deflect or manipulate the narrative. Her presence ensured that no action went unnoticed, that every word, gesture, and hesitation could be documented and incorporated into the broader strategy. Shonda's approach was methodical. She asked precise questions, avoided confrontation, and maintained an unwavering calm. Brandon, increasingly aware that Shonda's demeanor was unusually measured, felt a growing sense of unease. He could not understand why she remained so composed, why she seemed to anticipate his defenses, and why every misstep he made appeared carefully orchestrated. The second phase involved the strategic introduction of documented evidence. Shonda pulled up scanned contracts, email threads, and recorded conversations on her laptop. "I've compiled records of recent transactions and communications," she said, voice steady, eyes meeting Brandon's. "I believe this clarifies the situation and ensures that accountability is maintained." Brandon's eyes narrowed as he leaned forward, scanning the digital documents. I don't see how this is relevant," he stammered, his voice faltering. The confidence he had relied upon was eroding, replaced by subtle panic. Shonda continued, presenting each piece with precision, highlighting unauthorized actions, inconsistent statements, and manipulative behavior. Vanessa's guidance, conveyed via subtle signals from Shonda's encrypted messages, ensured that every presentation of evidence was timed for maximum impact. Brandon attempted to deflect to regain control, but each tactic was anticipated, neutralized, and countered with fact documentation and strategic questioning. By mid-afternoon, the psychological shift was undeniable. Brandon's authoritative posture faltered, his gestures became more defensive, and the faintest tremor of doubt crossed his voice. Shonda, maintaining her calm exterior, observed each reaction carefully, internalizing the subtle indicators that his dominance was slipping. The room's atmosphere had changed. The balance of power had quietly but decisively shifted. The final phase of the confrontation involved subtle but undeniable exposure. Shonda summarized the findings, presenting the collected evidence in a clear, organized manner. These records, cross-referenced with internal communications and financial data, demonstrate patterns of manipulation and decisions made without proper authorization. She stated, her tone factual, devoid of anger or accusation, yet commanding attention and respect. Brandon's attempts to interrupt, to assert control, were systematically neutralized by Shonda's calm precision. Every point he raised was anticipated, every argument countered with documented fact. Tasha monitored, recording additional confirmations, ensuring that the entirety of the confrontation would serve as incontrovertible evidence if necessary. By the end of the meeting, Brandon Powell sat in stunned silence. His carefully constructed persona of control dismantled his overconfidence, exposed as arrogance, and his manipulative actions laid bare. Shonda Powell, in contrast, exuded composed authority, the quiet strength of someone who had navigated fear, gathered knowledge, and executed strategy with precision. The confrontation had achieved its objective. Brandon had been forced into a position of vulnerability, his deception exposed and his psychological control over Shonda neutralized. Vanessa's silent support ensured that the evidence was comprehensive, coordinated, and irrefutable. Tasha's meticulous documentation solidified the impact, transforming subtle exposure into undeniable reality. As Shonda exited the conference room, she allowed herself a brief moment of quiet satisfaction. Fear and uncertainty had been transformed into strategic power control, had been reclaimed, and the groundwork for the next phase of Brandon's accountability had been firmly established. The psychological and tactical confrontation had reached its peak, leaving Brandon vulnerable and exposed, while Shonda emerged empowered, resolute, and unshakable. The following morning, Brandon Powell arrived at the office with his usual swagger, fully convinced that he had contained any potential disruption. Yet a subtle unease lingered, a faint shadow of doubt he could not entirely dismiss. He moved through the lobby, acknowledging colleagues with a forced smile. But the energy in the building seemed different, charged with an invisible tension. Brandon's overconfidence had blinded him to the forces quietly assembling against him. Shonda Powell arrived shortly after, poised and composed. Her entrance was unremarkable at first glance, but every observer would notice the quiet authority radiating from her presence. She carried herself with a calm assurance that contrasted sharply with Brandon's subtle agitation. No one except those involved in the unfolding plan understood the careful orchestration behind every move she made. Tasha Miller was already at her desk, monitoring communications, double-checking documents, and ensuring that every piece of evidence was immediately accessible. Her meticulous preparation meant that any attempt by Brandon to deflect, manipulate, or intimidate would be anticipated and neutralized. She had been a silent architect of this day, ensuring that the exposure would be complete and unassailable. Vanessa Powell, from her secure location within the company, observed Brandon's morning interactions. She had orchestrated subtle leaks, carefully timed, that ensured colleagues and associates would begin noticing discrepancies and inconsistencies in his statements and decisions. Her strategy was delicate sound-out without revealing the orchestrated nature of the exposure. Brandon, oblivious to her hand, would soon find that his carefully cultivated authority was eroding faster than he could comprehend. Shonda entered the executive suite, greeting Brandon with a measured smile. "Good morning, Brandon," she said, her voice calm, composed yet imbued with quiet authority. "I reviewed the latest financial summaries, and I believe there are several areas that require clarification." Brandon, confident in his control, waved her off. "I've already handled that," he replied, masking irritation with a casual tone. "Everything is under control." Shonda leaned slightly forward, placing a folder on the polished table. "Perhaps, but I cross-referenced the internal reports with recent transactions, and there are several inconsistencies that merit discussion." Her tone was neutral, professional, but firm. Each word was deliberate, designed to signal scrutiny without overt accusation. The room grew tense, though outwardly composed. Brandon attempted to regain control, referencing minor details, attempting to assert authority. Yet, with each assertion, Shonda countered with meticulously documented evidence. Financial discrepancies, unauthorized transfers, and contradictory statements were presented calmly, clearly, and strategically. Brandon, unprepared for the depth of preparation and precision, began to falter. By mid-morning, the effects were evident. Colleagues previously unaware of the underlying manipulation began to notice inconsistencies themselves. Subtle remarks, quietly shared observations, and the undeniable clarity of Shonda's evidence created a ripple of doubt. Brandon's credibility, once untouchable, began to fracture. Every calculated act of intimidation he had relied upon was now a liability. Tasha stepped in at strategic moments, providing additional documentation and reinforcing Shonda's narrative with indisputable proof. Emails Brandon had inadvertently sent notes revealing unauthorized decision-making, and recordings of conversations where he displayed coercive tactics were all presented methodically. Each revelation was precise, leaving no room for denial. Vanessa's influence was equally crucial. From behind the scenes, She ensured that internal communications highlighted Brandon's inconsistencies without appearing orchestrated. Subtle leaks, hints of concern among employees, and carefully timed observations created a landscape in which Brandon's credibility began to erode visibly. By the time a midday review meeting commenced, colleagues were quietly questioning decisions and actions they had previously accepted without scrutiny. Shonda maintained her calm professional demeanor throughout. She did not gloat or display triumph. Her strength lay in her composed authority. Brandon, by contrast, displayed a rare combination of confusion, frustration, and rising panic. His overconfidence had become his undoing, and every attempt to regain dominance only further exposed his vulnerabilities. By mid-afternoon, the culmination of careful preparation was clear. Brandon's position as the authoritative figure in the office had been systematically undermined. Colleagues openly questioned his judgment in meetings. Minor errors were highlighted with precise documentation, and the internal narrative of competence and control he had carefully cultivated began to crumble. Shonda's quiet but deliberate presentation of evidence had transformed the perception of his authority. Brandon attempted a defensive maneuver, trying to assert control over the narrative. Yet the documentation was comprehensive, the coordination seamless, and the psychological advantage firmly in Shonda's favor. Each counteraction he attempted was anticipated, neutralized, and documented for further leverage. His frustration became apparent, his body language betraying the panic he struggled to contain. By the end of the day, Brandon Powell's empire of control had been publicly and systematically dismantled. Financial institutions had been alerted to irregularities. Internal communications revealed manipulation, and colleagues had begun distancing themselves, questioning both his judgment and integrity. The once formidable aura of invincibility had been shattered. Shonda, observing the culmination of the day's efforts, felt a profound sense of empowerment. The meticulous documentation, coordinated strategy, and patient execution had not only exposed Brandon's manipulations, but it also restored her sense of control and agency. The psychological and professional dominance Brandon had wielded over her and the company had been neutralized, leaving him isolated, exposed, and vulnerable. Evenings settled over the city, casting long shadows across the office. Brandon sat in stunned silence, the full weight of his exposure pressing upon him. Shonda's composed demeanor, Tasha's precise monitoring, and Vanessa's strategic orchestration had achieved what fear confrontation or impulsive action could not: a complete and undeniable collapse of his authority and control. Shonda left the office quietly. Her steps measured, her presence calm yet commanding. The day had marked a pivotal turning point. Brandon Powell's public collapse was complete, and the forces of preparation, strategy, and meticulous observation had decisively shifted the balance of power. She had not only reclaimed control, but had orchestrated justice with precision, patience, and unwavering resolve. The morning after Brandon Powell's public collapse, the Powell residence was quiet in a way it hadn't been for weeks. Shonda Powell moved through the house with a sense of calm authority, a stark contrast to the tension that had filled every corner during Brandon's reign of manipulation. The chaos he had orchestrated, the fear he had instilled, and the constant vigilance he demanded were finally lifting. Now Shonda had the space to reclaim not just her life, but the power and agency that had been deliberately stripped away. Tasha Miller was already at her station, reviewing the comprehensive documentation of Brandon's misconduct. Every file, every recorded conversation, and every piece of evidence had been organized and cross-referenced. The meticulous work they had done over weeks had culminated in Brandon's collapse, and now the focus shifted toward recovery and consolidation. Tasha's expertise in data security and legal documentation ensured that Shonda's victory was not only decisive, but also impervious to counterattack. Shonda began by reviewing her personal and professional accounts. She carefully reconciled finances, ensuring that all assets under her control were secure and properly documented. Every transaction was scrutinized, any discrepancies resolved. The meticulousness of this process was not merely administrative, it was symbolic. Each step of reclamation reinforced her autonomy, reminding her that she was no longer subject to Brandon's manipulations. Vanessa Powell remained a key strategist, though her role had shifted from observation to advisory. From a secure location within the company, she provided guidance on stabilizing operations and rebuilding trust with colleagues and partners. Her insights ensured that the company could recover its stability without further disruptions. Vanessa's presence, even if not physically in the room, reinforced Shonda's confidence. Together, they had turned what once was a web of deceit into a framework for empowerment and strategic control. The first step in professional recovery involved addressing the internal team. Shonda convened a meeting with key staff, presenting a clear, calm, and confident vision for moving forward. She acknowledged the disruption caused by Brandon's actions without descending into recrimination or panic. Her demeanor was composed, authoritative, and forward-focused, signaling to everyone in the room that leadership had shifted and stability was returning. Effective immediately, Shonda stated, "We are implementing measures to ensure transparency, accountability, and a collaborative work environment. Any decisions will be documented, reviewed, and executed with integrity. This is our opportunity to rebuild stronger and more resilient than before." Her words resonated not because of force or intimidation, but because of the clarity, precision, and quiet authority with which they were delivered. Staff responded with cautious optimism, recognizing the shift in leadership and the security in Shonda's composed control. The psychological impact of her presence, combined with the exposure of Brandon's manipulations, instilled confidence and a renewed sense of purpose in the team. Tasha continued to manage evidence and communications, ensuring that all operations were transparent and secure. Every transaction, every decision, and every interaction was carefully monitored to prevent any lingering influence from Brandon's prior manipulations. The meticulous attention to detail reinforced the organizational shift, providing a clear boundary between past control and present autonomy. Shonda also took time to address her personal life. The months of fear and tension had left scars subtle but persistent on her emotional and psychological well-being. She scheduled meetings with trusted advisors, including financial consultants and legal professionals, to ensure that her personal assets, rights, and safety were fully protected. Every precaution she took was a reflection of the strategic mindset she had cultivated: prevention, preparedness, and the establishment of unequivocal boundaries. In parallel, Shonda began to restore her personal routines and ambitions. Activities and projects that had been deferred or neglected due to Brandon's manipulation were revisited. Professional opportunities were pursued with renewed vigor, and personal goals were realigned with the values of autonomy, empowerment, and strategic foresight. The recovery process was deliberate, emphasizing sustainability and resilience over speed. Vanessa remained a crucial sounding board, offering strategic advice on long-term company operations and governance. Her insight ensured that Shonda's recovery was not reactive, but anticipatory, building structures that would prevent any recurrence of manipulative influence. The partnership between Shonda and Vanessa was a silent demonstration of strength, combining insider knowledge with external strategy to fortify both personal and organizational domains. By late afternoon, Shonda paused to reflect on the journey that had brought her here. The fear, tension, and uncertainty of previous weeks have been transformed into strategy, evidence, and empowerment. Each step taken in the recovery phase reinforced her authority, her autonomy, and her capacity for decisive action. She recognized that control was not merely about exerting dominance, but about preparation, strategic foresight, and the deliberate cultivation of resilience. Tasha approached her with the latest updates. All systems are secure. Documents have been verified, transactions reconciled, and internal communications are stabilized. You have complete control over operations. Shonda nodded, a quiet satisfaction in her expression. "Excellent," she replied. "Let's continue monitoring, ensuring stability, and reinforcing transparency. Today was about reclaiming authority. Tomorrow, we solidify it." The evening brought a sense of calm and quiet reflection. Shonda Powell moved through the house, observing the restored order and the absence of Brandon's manipulative presence. The oppressive atmosphere of prior weeks had lifted, replaced by a measured, deliberate environment where she could exercise authority without fear or restraint. Every aspect of recovery was not merely practical but symbolic. A reclamation of self-power and purpose. By nightfall, Shonda prepared for the next phase of her journey, the solidification of power and the establishment of long-term structures to ensure that manipulation and intimidation could not recur. The psychological, professional, and personal foundations she had rebuilt were strong, fortified by strategy, observation, and the unwavering support of trusted allies. Shonda Powell, having navigated fear, manipulation, and deception, now stood as a figure of quiet authority and deliberate control. Recovery was no longer a reactive process. It was proactive, strategic, and empowering. The lessons of the past weeks had transformed fear into clarity, uncertainty into precision, and victimhood into empowerment. Shonda's reclamation of her life, her assets, and her authority was complete, and the groundwork was laid for the final stages of accountability and long-term empowerment. Brandon Powell woke to the harsh reality that the power he had long assumed was unshakable was rapidly slipping from his grasp. The public collapse of his authority within the company, coupled with the meticulously documented evidence compiled by Shonda Powell, had left him isolated, vulnerable, and desperate. For the first time in years, he faced the frightening prospect that every move he made could now be countered, anticipated, and used against him. Determined to reclaim control, Brandon devised a plan of counteraction. He sought to challenge the evidence contest, the documentation, and assert his authority through legal and professional maneuvers. His overconfidence, which had served him well in the past, now risked being his undoing. Yet he believed that a swift, aggressive response might intimidate Shonda and destabilize her carefully orchestrated position. Shonda, however, had anticipated this possibility. She had prepared for every conceivable reaction, meticulously organizing evidence, cross-referencing documents, and ensuring that each piece of information was indisputable. The strategic planning she had undertaken over weeks meant that Brandon's attempts at resistance would encounter formidable defenses at every turn. The first move came in the form of a formal legal challenge. Brandon retained high-powered attorneys and sought to invalidate certain documents, question the authenticity of records, and cast doubt on the credibility of witnesses. He filed motions that aimed to disrupt operations, create uncertainty, and undermine Shonda's authority. Every action was aggressive, precise, and calculated, reflecting the desperation of a man who recognized that his control was slipping. Shonda met these challenges with calm, deliberate authority. She reviewed every legal filing, prepared detailed responses, and coordinated with Tasha Miller and her legal counsel Ethan Crawford. Each argument presented by Brandon was countered with clear evidence, meticulously documented communications, and a comprehensive narrative that left no room for ambiguity. The legal strategy was not reactive, it was anticipatory, turning Brandon's aggression into proof of his ongoing manipulations. In parallel, Shonda continued to fortify her professional position. She convened strategic meetings with key stakeholders, presenting clear, factual information about the company's operations, financial integrity, and governance. Her composed demeanor, coupled with the undeniable clarity of evidence, reinforced confidence among colleagues and partners. Brandon's attempts to discredit her were met with measured, calm precision and the quiet authority of a leader who had regained control. Tasha played a critical role in monitoring all communications, ensuring that Brandon's efforts to manipulate, intimidate, or destabilize operations were documented and neutralized. Each email, phone call, and internal message was captured, time-stamped, and cross-referenced with existing evidence. The meticulous record-keeping created a robust defensive structure, transforming Brandon's aggression into an additional layer of accountability. Brandon attempted to escalate by engaging directly with staff and colleagues, hoping to sow doubt, manipulate perceptions, and regain influence. Yet, Shonda anticipated these moves. She provided clear, transparent information, engaged directly with stakeholders, and maintained a calm, authoritative presence. The psychological edge she had cultivated over weeks was now fully realized. Brandon's attempts at intimidation only reinforced his exposure. In one particularly tense encounter, Brandon confronted Shonda during a staff briefing, attempting to assert authority through aggressive rhetoric and veiled threats. "You've overstepped your bounds," he declared, his voice sharp, eyes flashing with frustration. "These documents, this narrative, you cannot dictate operations without my oversight." Shonda met his gaze steadily, her tone calm, measured, and commanding. "I am not overstepping. I am ensuring transparency, accountability, and stability," she replied, presenting key documents on her tablet. These records, cross-referenced with communications and financial data, establish the facts. They reflect reality, not perception. Brandon's frustration grew, but every attempt to interrupt or manipulate was neutralized by Shonda's precise control of the room, the documentation she presented, and the unwavering confidence she projected. Colleagues, now aware of the inconsistencies in Brandon's prior actions and reassured by the clarity of Shonda's presentation, began to question his authority quietly but unmistakably. The pressure on Brandon intensified as Tasha and Ethan Crawford ensured that every challenge he initiated, whether legal or operational, was met with irrefutable evidence and strategic foresight. The network of documentation, observation, and coordinated response created a system in which Brandon's resistance only reinforced the narrative of his misconduct and manipulation. Vanessa Powell, though operating from behind the scenes, continued to provide critical guidance. Her knowledge of Brandon's tendencies, his likely responses, and the subtle patterns in his behavior allowed Shonda and her team to anticipate every move, ensuring that resistance would fail at every turn. The alliance that had quietly formed between Shonda, Tasha, and Vanessa had transformed Brandon's desperation into a pathway for complete exposure. By midweek, Brandon's attempts at resistance had become increasingly erratic. Legal challenges were systematically addressed, communications were neutralized, and professional credibility was undermined by his own errors and prior missteps, now meticulously documented and presented. The more he fought, the clearer it became to observers that his authority was compromised, and Shonda's control over the situation was absolute. Shonda, observing the unfolding sequence of events, felt a profound sense of empowerment. Every action Brandon took to resist only further validated the evidence, reinforced the strategy, and strengthened her position. The psychological shift was complete. The man who had once wielded control taught through fear and intimidation was now exposed, cornered, and systematically dismantled by patient, deliberate, and strategic action. By the end of the week, Brandon Powell had exhausted his resources, strategies, and influence. His attempts to contest, manipulate, or intimidate had failed at every juncture. Shonda Powell's meticulous preparation, strategic foresight, and coordinated alliances ensured that resistance was not only futile, but further proof of his own misconduct. As the office quieted in the evening, Shonda reflected on the week's events. Fear, manipulation, and aggression had been transformed into opportunity, clarity, and empowerment. Brandon's attempts at resistance had only confirmed the inevitability of accountability. The crisis, once dominated by his control, had been decisively redirected into a narrative of evidence, clarity, and restored authority. Shonda Powell had not merely survived the onslaught of Brandon's desperation. She had navigated it with precision, strength, and deliberate strategy. Every move he had made to resist had been anticipated, countered, and documented. The culmination of weeks of preparation, alliance building, and careful observation had ensured that Brandon's efforts at resistance had strengthened her position rather than undermining it. The final chapter of Brandon Powell's deception began in the early hours of Monday morning. The office was quieter than usual, yet the atmosphere was charged with anticipation. Brandon had exhausted his attempts to resist, to manipulate, and to intimidate, but he remained blind to the full extent of the forces aligned against him. Shonda Powell, in contrast, moved through her morning routine with the quiet authority of someone who had not only survived, but was poised to ensure justice and closure. Her first priority was the legal finalization of Brandon's accountability. every document meticulously gathered over the past weeks, financial irregularities, unauthorized transactions, and recorded manipulations, was presented to her legal team. Ethan Crawford coordinated with precision filing final motions that would cement Brandon's exposure and prevent any avenue of escape. The careful strategy Shonda had followed from the beginning ensured that the legal foundation was rock solid, leaving Brandon no room for challenge. Brandon, unaware of the coordinated strategy unfolding, attempted a final effort to regain some semblance of control. He called a meeting of senior staff, hoping to assert authority through verbal dominance and intimidation. "We need to address these claims," he stated, attempting to mask his desperation with composure. "I expect full cooperation and clarity from everyone." Shonda entered the meeting with measured confidence, her posture calm, her tone authoritative. "Before we proceed, I'd like to review the compiled findings regarding recent financial and operational decisions," she said, her voice steady yet commanding. The staff observed quietly, sensing the subtle shift in power, but unsure of its full magnitude. Brandon's overconfidence had left him exposed. His attempts to dominate were now undermined by the evidence at hand. As Shonda methodically presented the documentation, the room's atmosphere shifted dramatically. Each unauthorized transaction, each inconsistency, and each recorded act of manipulation was laid out in a clear, factual manner. Brandon's carefully constructed facade of authority began to crumble in real time. His attempts to interject or deflect met with composed refutations backed by irrefutable proof. Vanessa Powell, though absent physically, continued to guide the strategy from a secure location. She provided insights into timing, reinforced key points, and suggested moments to emphasize inconsistencies that Brandon had overlooked. Her role ensured that every step of the process was precise, coordinated, and may maximize the impact of Shonda's presentation. By mid-morning, the psychological collapse of Brandon Powell was evident. His attempts at verbal control faltered. His arguments became defensive and inconsistent, and the once commanding presence that had intimidated colleagues and subordinates now appeared fragile and reactive. Shonda, in contrast, remained composed, calm, and unyielding, the embodiment of deliberate authority. Tasha Miller provided essential support throughout the proceedings. She documented every statement, every reaction, and every attempt by Brandon to deflect accountability. Her meticulous records ensured that there would be no room for ambiguity or reinterpretation. Every act of resistance, every defensive argument, and every display of manipulation was captured and reinforced the narrative of Brandon's misconduct. The critical turning point came when key stakeholders and colleagues who had previously been hesitant or uncertain began to question Brandon's credibility openly. The meticulous compilation of evidence, combined with the calm authority displayed by Shonda, left them with no alternative but to acknowledge the validity of the claims. Brandon's professional network, which had once reinforced his power, now reflected doubt, distrust, and a clear recognition of his manipulative behavior. Brandon attempted one last maneuver, a direct confrontation with Shonda in an effort to intimidate her and reassert control. "This is not over," he said, his voice strained, but attempting authority. "You think you've won, but these documents, these claims, they can be challenged." Shonda met his gaze without fear or hesitation. "This is not about winning or losing," she replied evenly. "It's about accountability, clarity, and integrity. The evidence is comprehensive, and the decisions moving forward will reflect the truth. Your influence over operations and over people will not determine what is right." Her calm authority silenced any room for debate, and even Brandon's supporters found themselves compelled by the clarity and precision of her presentation. By afternoon, the final measures were in place. Brandon's access to corporate accounts, decision-making authority, and influence over staff had been revoked. The legal filings ensured that he could no longer interfere with operations or manipulate outcomes. The meticulously orchestrated exposure had succeeded in removing his power entirely, leaving him isolated and unable to counteract the consequences of his actions. The staff, reassured by Shonda's composed leadership and the evidence presented, began to stabilize operations. Confidence returned gradually as decisions were now transparent, accountable, and guided by a leader whose authority had been reclaimed and solidified. The environment, once tense and unpredictable, transformed into a space of structure, clarity, and professionalism. Even as Brandon Powell's attempts at resistance collapsed, Shonda remained focused on the larger picture, establishing long-term safeguards to prevent similar manipulation from occurring again. Policies were updated, oversight mechanisms strengthened, and communication protocols formalized. Every lesson learned from Brandon's reign of control was incorporated into structures that would ensure transparency, fairness, and accountability. By evening, Brandon Powell had fully recognized the futility of further action. His influence, his authority, and his carefully cultivated image had been dismantled. Shonda Powell had not only neutralized his control, but had also transformed the environment, the company, and her own life into a space where empowerment, clarity, and justice prevailed. Shonda paused at her office window, gazing at the city skyline. The tension, fear, and uncertainty of previous weeks had been replaced by deliberate, calm authority. She had navigated manipulation, intimidation, and resistance with patient strategy and unwavering focus. The culmination of her efforts, legal, strategic, and psychological, had ensured that Brandon Powell's power was permanently curtailed. Vanessa Powell's guidance and Tasha Miller's meticulous support had been indispensable. The alliance formed in secrecy had transformed a situation of vulnerability into one of decisive empowerment. Shonda recognized that the true victory lay not in retaliation, but in the deliberate reclamation of control, integrity, and authority. By nightfall, Shonda Powell had fully reestablished her leadership, personal agency, and strategic dominance. The storm of deception and manipulation had been weathered, and the aftermath was a landscape of clarity, empowerment, and justice. Brandon Powell, isolated and accountable, was a stark contrast to the composed, authoritative, and unshakable presence Shonda had cultivated. The final chapter of Brandon's reign had concluded. What remained was not simply survival or exposure, but the full restoration of power, integrity, and agency. Shonda Powell had orchestrated the end of deception with precision, patience, and unwavering focus, leaving a lasting impression. Control could be reclaimed, authority restored, and justice ensured even against the most calculated adversary. The morning sun filtered through the blinds, casting soft lines across Shonda Powell's office. After weeks of tension, manipulation, and confrontation, the environment now felt different, calm, structured, and undeniably hers. Every detail of her life, every facet of her professional empire, had been meticulously reclaimed. The chaos Brandon Powell had sown was now replaced with clarity, authority, and empowerment. Shonda walked through the office with quiet confidence, her presence commanding without force, her steps measured and purposeful. The final stage of her journey was not about retaliation. It was about consolidation and affirmation. Her victory over Brandon was complete, but the real triumph lay in how she would move forward fully in control, unshakable and unbound by fear or manipulation. She had endured deceit, intimidation, and covert attacks, yet she emerged not just unscathed, but stronger, more strategic, and undeniably empowered. Shonda began her day with a review of operational strategies. Every department, every team, every decision-making process was analyzed, refined, and fortified. The chaos left in Brandon's wake had been replaced by precise procedures, accountability structures, and transparency measures. Shonda ensured that the power dynamic within the company was now fully aligned with ethical practice and strategic foresight. Tasha Miller was already at her station monitoring communications, reviewing transactions, and confirming that all systems were secure. The partnership that had been forged during Brandon's collapse remained indispensable. Tasha's meticulous attention to detail, combined with Shonda's strategic oversight, created an environment where no misstep could go unnoticed and no manipulation could thrive. Vanessa Powell, though no longer directly involved in day-to-day operations, continued to provide guidance from her secure location. Her knowledge of Brandon's tactics, combined with her strategic insight, ensured that the systems Shonda put in place were resilient and robust. The alliance, initially forged in secrecy, had transitioned seamlessly into a framework of enduring strength capable of preventing future threats. Shonda convened a meeting with her senior leadership team. Her tone was composed, authoritative, and calm, a stark contrast to the anxiety that had once pervaded the office. Our priority, she stated, is clarity, integrity, and sustained growth. We've addressed past inconsistencies, implemented rigorous accountability measures, and ensured that transparency is the foundation of all operations. Moving forward, every decision will be deliberate, documented, and aligned with these principles. Colleagues and stakeholders listened intently. Shonda's composed presence, combined with the incontrovertible clarity of evidence and strategy, instilled confidence and trust. The psychological shift was clear. She was no longer vulnerable, no longer subject to intimidation, and no longer defined by Brandon's manipulative shadow. Throughout the day, Shonda reviewed strategic initiatives that had been stalled during Brandon's control. Projects, partnerships, and opportunities were reinvigorated with new energy and a sense of purpose. Decisions were made with deliberate intent, transparency, and precision, reflecting the leadership style that had emerged from her journey. Every action reinforced her authority and affirmed her regained power. In parallel, Shonda ensured the integration of lessons learned. Policies were updated, oversight mechanisms strengthened, and communication protocols formalized. Every structural adjustment was designed to maintain integrity, prevent manipulation, and foster a culture of accountability. The recovery was holistic, encompassing not only personal empowerment, but also organizational resilience. By afternoon, Shonda allowed herself a moment to reflect on the personal transformation she had undergone. The fear and anxiety that Brandon had instilled were replaced by strategic clarity, patience, and an unshakable sense of agency. Her authority was no longer contingent on appearances or intimidation. It was grounded in preparation knowledge and deliberate action. Tasha approached with the latest operational reports. "Everything is stable," she said. "All systems are aligned, transactions verified, and oversight measures in place. Your control is comprehensive and secured." Shonda nodded, a calm satisfaction on her face. "Excellent," she replied. "Let's continue to monitor and refine. Today is about consolidation. Tomorrow about growth. We've reclaimed what was ours, but now we ensure it thrives." The evening brought a quiet, reflective moment. Shonda walked through the office, noting the restored order and professionalism. The oppressive presence that had once defined her days was gone, replaced by structure, authority, and empowerment. Every corner of the workspace, every interaction, and every decision reflected her regained control and strategic foresight. She took a moment to acknowledge the role of her allies. Vanessa's strategic insight had been crucial. Tasha's meticulous monitoring indispensable, and their combined efforts had transformed a period of vulnerability into one of empowerment and lasting authority. The experience had demonstrated the power of collaboration, observation, and patient strategy, highlighting that strength was often quiet, deliberate, and methodical. Shonda also reflected on the psychological journey. Her empowerment was not derived from confrontation or vengeance, but from strategy, clarity, and deliberate action. By navigating fear, documenting evidence, and coordinating a precise response, she had reclaimed authority, personal agency, and professional control. The lesson was clear. True power is rooted in preparation, observation, and unwavering focus, not in reactionary measures or impulsive retaliation. As night fell, Shonda looked out over the city skyline. The lights twinkled like stars, each one a testament to the restored order, stability, and clarity in her life. The journey from fear to empowerment had been arduous, but it was complete. Brandon Powell, stripped of control and influence, was a figure of past adversity, while Shonda Powell stood fully in command of her life, her company, and her future. The final reflection was one of deliberate clarity. Empowerment is a process, not a reaction. It is cultivated through patient strategy and the careful orchestration of knowledge and alliances. Shonda Powell had navigated deception, manipulation, and aggression with composure and precision, emerging not only victorious, but transformed. Her authority was no longer threatened, her power secured, and her life reclaimed in full. The day ended with a sense of quiet triumph. Shonda Powell had completed the arc from victimhood to empowerment, from uncertainty to decisive authority. The structural, psychological, and professional reclamation ensured that her control was enduring, her influence unassailable, and her presence a testament to the power of deliberate strategic action. She allowed herself a rare, private smile, the satisfaction of a journey completed. Fear and manipulation had been replaced by authority, clarity, and deliberate empowerment. The reclamation was complete, the lessons learned profound, and the future unbounded, controlled, and fully hers. The journey of Shonda Powell is more than a story of betrayal and justice. It is a testament to the resilience and inner strength that resides within all of us. Life may place us in situations where fear, manipulation, and uncertainty seem overwhelming, where those we trust turn out to be the source of our deepest challenges. Yet Shonda's story reminds us that true empowerment is not born from anger or vengeance, but from patient strategy and unwavering belief in oneself. She teaches us that even in the darkest moments, careful observation, deliberate action, and the support of trustworthy allies can transform vulnerability into strength. The most profound lesson is that control over our lives is never truly lost. It may be obscured by circumstances, but it can always be reclaimed through resilience, focus, and courage. Every obstacle is an opportunity to grow, every setback a chance to learn, and every challenge a doorway to personal empowerment. Shonda's journey shows that strength is often quiet, deliberate, and rooted in self-respect and clarity of purpose. It is in the calm, patient pursuit of justice and integrity that true power emerges. If Shonda's story inspired you, take a moment to reflect on your own challenges and how you can reclaim your power with grace and strategy. Share your thoughts. In the comments below, we would love to hear how you've turned adversity into strength. And if you want to follow more stories of empowerment, resilience, and transformation, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next journey of courage and triumph.